It was a freezing night in Chicago, snow whipping down the empty streets. Officer Daniel Harris, exhausted from his shift, walked with Max, his loyal German shepherd. Then he saw her, a little girl pressed against a brick wall, barefoot, clutching an empty lunchbox. His heart froze. What kind of world leaves a child like this? In that moment, Daniel knew he couldn't just pass by. This wasn't duty anymore. It was God's test, and what he chose next would change both their lives forever. What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind howled down the narrow streets of Chicago as snow fell in relentless sheets, coating the sidewalks in white and muffling the city's usual noise. The lamps glowed dimly through the curtain of frost, and the bitter cold cut through layers of clothing like knives. It was the kind of night when even the city itself seemed to shiver. Officer Daniel Harris, 36 years old, pulled his thick police-issued coat tighter as he walked down an alleyway with his loyal German shepherd by his side. Daniel was tall, broad-shouldered, with short, dark brown hair flecked with silver strands at his temples, a face defined by sharp cheekbones and a square jaw. He had a short, unshaven beard that made him look perpetually tired, but it was his eyes, hazel with faint lines at the edges, that betrayed the weight he carried. Daniel had been a police officer in Chicago for nearly a decade, and though respected by his colleagues for his steady resolve, the job had left scars invisible to the eye. A few years earlier, he had been too late to save a child during a domestic violence case. That night haunted him still, shaping his fierce protectiveness for children, fueling a quiet promise that he would never hesitate again. At his side padded Max, his 6-year-old retired canine partner. Max was a German shepherd of imposing stature, his coat thick and mottled black and tan, with a muscular body honed from years of work in search and rescue. His amber eyes were sharp, watchful, reflecting a kind of wisdom that only dogs who had seen the worst of human cruelty seemed to carry. Though officially retired after a leg injury 2 years earlier, Max had healed well and still walked with the confidence of a guardian. The bond between Daniel and Max ran deeper than handler and dog. They had shared dangers, loss, and small victories. To Daniel, Max was not just a partner, but family. Daniel adjusted his gloves, scanning the alley. His boots crunched against ice as Max's nose swept the ground, tail swishing with focus. The city was quiet, eerily so, broken only by the distant hum of a car engine somewhere beyond the snowstorm. Daniel was thinking of heading back when Max froze, ears pricking forward. A low growl rumbled in the dog's throat. Daniel followed Max's gaze, squinting through the swirling flakes. Against the brick wall, barely visible in the shadows, stood a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6. Her body was pressed flat against the wall as if she wanted to melt into it, her tiny arms locked stiff at her sides. She wore only a thin pink dress, frayed at the edges, fluttering uselessly in the wind. Her bare feet were planted on the icy ground, skin mottled red with frostbite, toes curled against the slush. Her hair was light brown, tangled, strands sticking to her pale cheeks, and her eyes, wide, dark hazel eyes, were glassy, reflecting both fear and resignation. For a second, Daniel thought she might be a ghost of the city, some tragic vision conjured by his weary mind. But then her lips moved and he heard the faintest whisper carried by the storm. He crouched slightly, softening his voice as he approached, hands open to show he meant no harm. "Hey, sweetheart. Are you okay? What's your name?" The girl flinched at the sound of his voice, her shoulders jerking like a startled animal. Max sat down a few feet away, ears still forward, but quiet now, as if sensing the need for calm. Daniel studied her trembling frame, his chest tightening. Every instinct in him screamed that she was in danger. The girl clutched something to her chest. It was a lunchbox plastic, faded with a unicorn sticker peeling off the lid. The corners were patched with tape. Daniel noticed how her tiny fingers were cracked and raw, clutching the box like armor. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost swallowed by the snow. "I can't go inside," she whispered. Daniel leaned closer, straining to hear. "Why not?" She shook her head slowly, her hair whipping in the wind. "I can't come in until I bring dinner." The words punched the air from Daniel's lungs. He blinked, fighting down a surge of anger. He had heard countless stories of neglect, of children left to fend for themselves, but to see this small figure trembling in the snow made his blood boil. His heart ached with the weight of her words. He tried to keep his voice steady. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl's lips trembled. "Sophie. Sophie Miller." Daniel repeated it softly, like a vow. "Sophie, I'm Officer Harris, and this is Max." He motioned to the dog, who tilted his head and wagged his tail once, as if offering reassurance. Sophie's eyes flicked toward Max, a flicker of wonder piercing through her fear. Daniel took off his heavy coat without a second thought. As he wrapped it around Sophie's small shoulders, she stiffened at first, her body tense as if expecting a blow. Then slowly, she sagged into the warmth, releasing a tiny sigh that nearly broke Daniel's heart. Snowflakes clung to her lashes, melting into tears she didn't wipe away. As Daniel crouched beside her, he felt a movement tugging at his focus. Max suddenly growled, his gaze fixed on the mouth of the alley. Daniel turned sharply and spotted it. An old delivery truck parked under a flickering streetlight. Its paint was rusted, the windshield fogged. Through the falling snow, Daniel caught sight of shadows moving inside the cab, quick and furtive. Two figures slipped out, their collars pulled high, faces obscured. They moved with hurried precision, as if guarding something. Daniel's instincts bristled. He placed a protective arm around Sophie and kept his voice low. "It's okay, you're safe with me." His mind churned. Was Patricia Doyle, the aunt he had heard whispers about in prior calls, connected to these figures? The timing, the secrecy, it set his teeth on edge. Max barked once, loud and sharp, the kind of bark that was both warning and challenge. The men paused for a second before disappearing into the storm, vanishing toward the main road. Daniel watched them go, unease crawling down his spine. Something else was happening in this neighborhood, something beyond Sophie's plight, and Max had just drawn his attention to it. He looked down at the little girl, her face pale but eyes wide with fear. She clutched the lunchbox tighter. "Please," she murmured, "don't let them be mad." Daniel swallowed hard, fighting the anger and sorrow welling inside him. His promise to his younger self echoed through his mind. Never again would he fail a child who needed saving. He glanced at Max, whose amber eyes locked onto his with unspoken understanding. This wasn't just chance, it was a moment of choice. Daniel bent closer to Sophie, his voice steady, warm, resolute. "You don't have to stand out here anymore. Not tonight, not ever again. I'm here now." Snow swirled around them, but for the first time that night, Daniel felt a clarity cutting through the storm. This was the beginning of something larger than himself, a story that would test his courage, uncover hidden dangers, and decide not only Sophie's fate, but perhaps his own redemption. The snowstorm raged harder as Daniel Harris guided Sophie down the dimly lit streets, his coat still wrapped around her tiny frame. Max walked close at his side, the German shepherd's amber eyes darting left and right, alert to every sound. Sophie clutched her cracked lunchbox tightly against her chest, her lips pressed into a line as if the simple act of speaking might invite punishment. Daniel adjusted his pace to match her hesitant steps. He kept his voice low and steady, the way one would talk to a child who had lived too long in fear. "We're almost there, sweetheart. Just stay close." Sophie only nodded, her damp hair clinging to her face. The apartment complex loomed ahead, an aging brick building on the edge of a forgotten block. The paint on the fire escapes was chipped, windows cracked, and the faint yellow glow of one light flickered above the entrance door. Max's ears twitched uneasily as they stepped inside, and Daniel could smell mildew mixed with cigarette smoke, the scent of neglect. At the end of the hallway, a door creaked open. Standing there was Patricia Doyle, Sophie's aunt. Patricia was in her mid-40s, of medium height but with a sharp, angular frame that seemed hardened by years of bitterness. Her dyed black hair hung in uneven strands around her pale, lined face. She wore a red wool cardigan that smelled faintly of liquor, and a cigarette balanced between two fingers, the ash dangling dangerously close to the carpet. Her eyes, cold, gray, and narrow, looked Daniel up and down before flicking to Sophie. A mixture of annoyance and practiced hostility spread across her features. "Well," Patricia said, her voice rough and sharp, "looks like someone brought you home." "I told you not to wander." Sophie shrank behind Daniel, clutching his coat tighter. Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I found your niece outside in the snow, barefoot. She told me she wasn't allowed inside unless she brought food." Patricia's lips curled into a dismissive smile. She exhaled a stream of smoke, shaking her head. "That girl has always had a wild imagination. You'd think she was writing fairy tales the way she talks. She makes up stories for attention." Daniel studied her carefully. Years on the force had taught him how to read the smallest signs: darting eyes, defensive posture, the quick hostility of someone who feared exposure. Patricia's words sounded rehearsed, as though she had said them many times before. Sophie pressed closer to his side, and when Daniel glanced down, she was staring at the floor. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached into the pocket of his coat and pressed something into his palm. He looked down discreetly. It was a folded piece of paper, soft from overuse. He opened it just enough to see crude pencil lines. A small, crouching figure inside a square space, a heavy padlock drawn over the door. His stomach tightened. Patricia noticed the movement. "She's always scribbling nonsense like that," she said quickly, her tone sharpening. "You know how kids are. Drama over nothing." Daniel tucked the drawing safely away, his mind racing. He wanted to push harder, to demand answers, but the hallway air was thick with hostility, and he could feel Sophie trembling at his side. He decided for now to observe, to build trust with the girl and gather the truth carefully. Max's low growl cut through the tension. The dog's nose was pressed to the floorboards near the stairwell, his tail rigid, ears stiff. He circled once, then moved toward the basement door at the end of the hallway, sniffing intently. Daniel caught the faint smell, too gasoline mixed with the acrid tang of cigarette smoke and something metallic. He filed it away, masking his suspicion behind a neutral expression. Patricia followed Daniel's gaze toward Max and scoffed. "Your mutt's making a fuss over nothing. There's nothing down there but old storage." But Daniel didn't miss the flash of unease that flickered across her face before she forced her smile back into place. Wanting to test her, he said, "It wouldn't hurt to take a look." "These old basements sometimes attract squatters." Patricia bristled, crossing her arms over her chest. "That won't be necessary, officer. You've done your good deed for the night. Thank you for bringing her back, but we don't need interference." "I'll handle Sophie." Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew confrontation here could escalate badly, especially with Sophie watching. He crouched to the girl's level instead, keeping his voice gentle. "Are you going to be okay tonight?" Sophie's wide eyes flicked toward Patricia and then down to her lunchbox. She didn't answer, but her small hand gripped Daniel's sleeve for a second before letting go. It was a silent plea, and it struck him harder than any words. Daniel straightened, forcing a polite smile toward Patricia. "All right, but I'll be checking back soon. If Sophie needs anything, you can reach me at the precinct." He handed her his card, though she barely glanced at it before dropping it onto a side table cluttered with ashtrays. As Daniel turned to leave, Max hesitated, staring hard at the basement door. Daniel gave the leash a soft tug, and the shepherd finally followed, though not without another low growl that echoed faintly in the stairwell. Outside, the storm slapped them with icy wind. Daniel stopped under the flickering streetlight, pulling out the drawing Sophie had given him. The crude image of the locked closet felt like a cry for help. He knew he couldn't ignore it. His gut told him that Patricia's home held secrets darker than she admitted, and Max's instincts about the basement added another layer of suspicion. Daniel's thoughts churned. He had to move carefully, both for Sophie's sake and to avoid tipping off Patricia too soon. But the image of Sophie's tiny body pressed against the wall in the snow, whispering that she couldn't come in without food, replayed in his mind with painful clarity. He clenched the drawing in his hand, his resolve hardening. This was not over. Max nudged his side with a cold nose, as if reminding him that he wasn't alone in this fight. Daniel exhaled a cloud of white breath, the storm swirling around him, and whispered, "We'll get her out of this, boy." One way or another, the storm had lessened by morning, but Chicago's streets were still buried under blankets of snow, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Daniel Harris walked briskly toward the apartment complex he had visited the night before, Max trotting at his side with steady focus. The German shepherd's thick black and tan coat bristled slightly against the cold, and every so often his ears flicked at the faint noises of a city waking under ice. Daniel carried a paper bag filled with hot sandwiches, a thermos of soup, and a neatly folded wool sweater and winter boots he had bought at a store that opened early. The image of Sophie's fragile frame pressed into the wall, her whisper about bringing dinner, had not left his mind all night. He hadn't slept much. Instead, he had pored over her drawing of the locked closet, the crude padlock sketched with urgency, and resolved to see the truth for himself. Inside the building, the hallway smelled of stale smoke and damp plaster. Patricia's door creaked when Daniel knocked, but no one answered. He knocked again, harder this time, and finally the lock rattled. Sophie peeked out from behind the doorframe. Her face was pale, her hair matted from sleep, and she wore the same pink dress he had seen the night before. She looked up at him with a flicker of both hope and fear. "Morning, Sophie," Daniel said softly, crouching so his eyes met hers. He held up the bag. "I brought breakfast, and something to keep you warm." She glanced over her shoulder before opening the door wider. The apartment inside was dim, the curtains drawn, and the faint noise of a television left on somewhere in another room. Patricia was nowhere in sight. Sophie motioned with her small hand for Daniel to follow, her lips pressing together as though she wanted to speak but dared not. Max padded quietly in after them, sniffing the air. The dog's tail flicked once, then lowered, his nose pulling him toward the back of the apartment. Sophie tugged Daniel's sleeve gently and pointed to a narrow door near the kitchen. Her eyes were wide, glassy, and her tiny body trembled as she whispered, "That's where I sleep." Daniel frowned, his heart sinking. He walked closer and opened the door. What he saw twisted his stomach. The space was barely larger than a closet. A stained mat lay on the floor, thin and worn, with a tattered blanket thrown on top. In the corner sat a plastic bucket, half filled with water. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and dust. No pillow, no light, just darkness. He turned back toward Sophie, who stood hugging her lunchbox to her chest like a shield. Her voice was nearly inaudible. "Sometimes she locks it." "If I'm bad," Daniel clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. Every instinct told him to march straight to Patricia, but anger wouldn't protect Sophie right now. Instead, he took a breath, crouched again, and placed his hands gently on her shoulders. "You should never have to sleep in a place like that. Not ever." He pulled the sweater from the bag and helped her slip into it. The sleeves hung long over her tiny arms, but she smiled faintly as the warmth wrapped around her. Patricia's voice cut through the air like a whip. "What are you doing here again?" Daniel stood quickly, turning to see her in the doorway of the living room. Her face was pale, her hair a mess, and she wore a silk robe that reeked faintly of alcohol. She held a mug in one hand, though the smell of liquor was unmistakable. Her eyes narrowed at Daniel. "Didn't I tell you not to interfere?" "I'm making sure Sophie is safe," Daniel said calmly but firmly. "She's freezing." "She needs proper clothes and food," Patricia scoffed, waving her mug. "She's fine." "Toughens her up. Don't you officers have better things to do than babysit?" Daniel ignored her, crouched again to Sophie and whispered, "Would you like to come with me?" "Just for a little while. We can get you checked at the hospital. Warm place, nice people." Sophie hesitated, her eyes darting to her aunt. Patricia's gaze hardened. "She's not going anywhere." Max suddenly barked, low and sharp, his body angled toward the hallway window. Daniel followed his line of sight. A man stood across the street, leaning against a lamppost, pretending to smoke. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a heavy jacket pulled up around his neck. Even from here, Daniel could see the man wasn't truly smoking. The cigarette was unlit. His eyes kept darting toward the apartment building. Daniel's police instincts flared. This wasn't coincidence. "Come on, Sophie," he said quickly, lifting the bag of food. "Let's step out for a bit." Patricia moved as if to block the door, but Daniel met her gaze, his voice low and edged with authority. "If you try to stop me, I'll call Child Protective Services right now." "They'll be interested in that closet." Patricia froze, her face draining of color. She muttered something under her breath but didn't move further. Sophie clutched her lunchbox and hurried to Daniel's side. Max stayed close, his hackles rising as they stepped into the cold. The man at the lamppost straightened and began walking behind them at a distance. Daniel noticed it in the reflection of a shop window. Max noticed too, his low growl vibrated against the leash. Daniel whispered to the dog, "Easy, boy, we'll handle this." They reached Daniel's car, a black SUV parked a block away. Sophie climbed into the back, hugging her lunchbox tightly. Max leapt in after her, sitting protectively at her side. Daniel slid behind the wheel, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The man had stopped at the corner, pretending to tie his boot, but clearly watching them. The drive to the hospital was tense. Snowflakes battered the windshield, wipers scraping rhythmically. Sophie sat in silence, sipping the soup Daniel had poured into a small cup for her. Her eyes never left Max, who leaned close, offering the quiet comfort of his presence. At one stoplight, Daniel glanced again in the mirror. A dark sedan had appeared 2 cars back, its headlights glaring through the snow. The man from the lamppost sat behind the wheel. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. This wasn't random, it was surveillance. Sophie wasn't just neglected. There was something bigger surrounding her situation, something dangerous. By the time they pulled into the hospital's emergency entrance, the sedan had disappeared into traffic. Daniel parked quickly and helped Sophie out, wrapping her in the wool sweater again. Max stayed alert, his ears. This child needs to be seen right away. She's been neglected, possibly abused. As the nurse hurried them toward an exam room, Daniel's mind raced. He had uncovered only a piece of Sophie's reality, but already shadows were circling. Patricia was hiding something, and now strange men were watching. He knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about neglect anymore. Something larger, darker, and far more dangerous was at play, and he was determined to expose it. The pediatric wing of the hospital was warmer than the rest of the building, lit by fluorescent lights that hummed softly above. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, but underneath it all lingered something heavier, the tension of lives caught between hope and despair. Daniel Harris sat in the corner of the small exam room, his uniform jacket hanging on the back of the chair, his hazel eyes fixed on Sophie as the doctor moved gently around her. Sophie perched stiffly on the edge of the examination table, her cracked lunchbox clutched tightly against her knees as if it were her last shield. Max lay on the tiled floor nearby, his black and tan coat gleaming under the artificial light, amber eyes never leaving the girl, his ears twitching every time she flinched at the sound of latex gloves snapping or metal instruments clinking. The doctor was Dr. Renee Marshall, a woman in her early 50s with a tall, lean frame and sharp but compassionate features. Her short blonde hair was streaked with silver and neatly combed back, her pale blue eyes focused and probing, yet softened whenever they rested on Sophie. Years of work in pediatrics had made her both patient and fiercely protective of children. The fine lines around her mouth hinted at battles fought in courtrooms and against bureaucracies that had failed young patients before. She moved with quiet authority, speaking in a calm voice as she examined Sophie's thin arms. "Multiple contusions, in various stages of healing," Renee said quietly, her pen scratching notes onto a chart. "Some of these are weeks old, others only a day or two." She lifted Sophie's sweater slightly, revealing faint bruises along her ribs and an old scar running diagonally across her side. Daniel felt his stomach tighten at the sight, his fists curling involuntarily. Sophie sat still, her small shoulders trembling but her lips pressed shut, as though she had long since learned that silence was safer than complaint. Renee crouched down to Sophie's level, her tone gentle but firm. "Sweetheart, do you remember how you got these bruises?" Sophie's wide hazel eyes flicked to Daniel for a brief second, then dropped back to her lunchbox. Her voice was almost inaudible. "Sometimes the closet is too small. I fall." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, forcing himself to breathe evenly. His mind flashed to the drawing Sophie had given him, the crude padlock sketched with desperate urgency. He wanted to shout, to break something, but he knew now his anger would serve no one. Instead, he reached over and gave her shoulder the lightest squeeze. "You did nothing wrong, Sophie," he murmured. "Nothing at all." The exam concluded, and Renee stepped outside with Daniel. In the hallway, they were joined by Karen Willis, the hospital's assigned social worker. Karen was in her early 40s, average height but with a sturdy frame, her curly brown hair cropped short, glasses perched on her nose. Her face carried a warmth that put children at ease, but her dark eyes were sharp, constantly assessing. Years of dealing with abused and neglected children had given her a calm, almost maternal patience, yet underneath it, Daniel sensed a steel core hardened by having to confront countless parents and guardians who had failed their charges. Karen flipped through the notes Renee handed her, her brow furrowed. "This is more than neglect. It's systematic abuse, malnourishment, repeated confinement, untreated injuries. This girl has been invisible for too long." She looked directly at Daniel. "We'll open an immediate protective case. But if you stay involved, Officer Harris, you'll need to be prepared. Families like this, they don't let go without a fight." Daniel nodded grimly. I'm not walking away, not this time. It wasn't long before the fight began. Later that afternoon, as Sophie was resting under the watch of a nurse, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. When he answered, the line was filled with static, and then a low voice spoke. "Back off, Harris. The girl isn't your problem. Meddle again and you'll regret it." The line went dead before Daniel could respond. His jaw clenched, the memory of the strange man following them earlier flashing through his mind. This wasn't just about Patricia anymore. Someone else had a stake in this. Meanwhile, Max had been restless. Daniel took him for a walk around the hospital's rear lot, hoping the dog might relax. But as they passed the row of dumpsters and maintenance sheds, Max stopped abruptly, nose pressed to the snow. His hackles rose, a low growl building in his throat. Daniel followed his lead and spotted a small package half buried near the back of a van. It was wrapped in brown paper, hastily taped. When he crouched to examine it, he noticed the faint smell of gasoline and tobacco clinging to it. Inside, through a tear in the wrapping, he saw cartons of contraband cigarettes, the kind smuggled in bulk and sold cheaply on the street. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He knew enough from his time on patrol to recognize the signs of a smuggling operation. Patricia Doyle's home, Max's fixation on the basement, and now this package. It was all part of something larger. Sophie's abuse wasn't just cruelty. It was tied to criminal activity that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden. He carefully marked the location, snapped a photo with his phone, and slipped the package back where he found it. Evidence was mounting, but he needed to move carefully. That evening, Karen joined Daniel in the hospital cafeteria, where the smell of burnt coffee and fried food clung to the air. She sat across from him, her clipboard stacked with forms. "I've seen too many kids like Sophie disappear into red tape," she said, her tone measured but heavy with experience. "If Patricia fights, she'll have lawyers and they'll accuse you of overstepping, maybe even of taking Sophie without consent." "She already has," Daniel muttered. He slid his phone across the table, showing Karen the text message and the photo of the smuggling package. Karen's eyes darkened as she scanned them. "You're stepping into something dangerous," she said. "But this might be the leverage we need. If Patricia is involved in trafficking contraband, her credibility is finished." She leaned forward. "The key is proving it." As if on cue, Daniel's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an official notice. Patricia Doyle had filed a formal complaint accusing him of abducting Sophie. A hearing would be scheduled within days. Patricia had wasted no time. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "She's not just covering her tracks, she's striking first." Karen's expression was grim but steady. "Then we prepare for battle." Max, lying at Daniel's feet, lifted his head and gave a quiet whine, his amber eyes meeting Daniel's with the loyalty of a partner who had faced storms before. Daniel reached down, scratching behind his ears. "We're not letting them win, boy." Not this time. The morning of the hearing was gray and bitterly cold, the kind of Chicago winter day where the air itself seemed made of steel. Outside the courthouse, the wind whipped through the streets, scattering snow in stinging flurries. Daniel Harris adjusted the collar of his dark police coat, his broad shoulders squared, though his stomach felt tight with unease. Beside him, Sophie walked with small, cautious steps, her new boots squeaking faintly on the icy pavement. She held her cracked lunchbox close against her chest, the faded unicorn sticker peeling at the corners. Max padded faithfully at their side, his thick black and tan coat brushed by the wind, amber eyes sharp and watchful. The dog moved like a guardian, every muscle coiled, as if he too sensed the battle that awaited them inside. The courtroom itself was high-ceilinged and imposing, with heavy oak benches polished to a dull shine. At the far end sat Judge Evelyn Whitaker, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled neatly into a bun. Her features were stern but not unkind, framed by the long black robes of her office. Her reputation preceded her. She was known for cutting through theatrics to get to the truth. Decades on the bench had given her an air of quiet authority, the kind that commanded attention without raising her voice. On one side of the room sat Patricia Doyle, Sophie's aunt. She wore a bright red coat that stood out against the somber tones of the courtroom, her dyed black hair styled stiffly, her lips painted a harsh crimson. Her sharp cheekbones and narrowed eyes gave her a cold, almost predatory look. Patricia's lawyer, Martin Crowley, a slick man in his 40s with thinning blonde hair and a pinstripe suit that looked more expensive than his integrity, whispered constantly into her ear. Martin had a reputation in Chicago for defending unsavory clients' gang affiliates, smugglers, landlords accused of exploitation. He was ambitious, sharp-tongued, and unashamed of bending the law as far as it would go. Daniel sat quietly across the aisle, Sophie tucked close to his side, while Max lay obediently at his feet. Karen Willis, the social worker, straightened her gray wool scarf and organized her files, her expression calm but her eyes fierce. Dr. Renee Marshall adjusted her glasses, her face lined with fatigue but radiating a determination that had not waned in years of advocacy. Amelia Grant, the child advocacy attorney Daniel had asked for help, joined them at the table. Amelia was in her late 30s with auburn hair tied back, a slender figure, and sharp hazel eyes. Her voice carried both compassion and fire, qualities that made her one of the best in her field. She was relentless in her pursuit of justice for children, her reputation built on cases where others had failed. The hearing began with opening remarks, Judge Whitaker's voice steady. This court will determine whether the child, Sophie Miller, has been subjected to neglect or abuse, and whether guardianship should be reassigned. Counselors, proceed. Martin Crowley stood first, his voice oozing false civility. Your Honor, this is a tragic misunderstanding. My client, Patricia Doyle, has raised her niece alone after the untimely death of Sophie's mother. She works long hours to provide for her. The accusations made by Officer Harris are exaggerated, driven perhaps by his own savior complex. He gestured toward Daniel dismissively, a lonely police officer seeking to play the hero. Daniel felt his jaw tighten, but Amelia's hand on his arm reminded him to stay calm. Then Amelia rose, her voice firm. Your Honor, the evidence will show this is no misunderstanding. This child was found barefoot in a snowstorm, trembling, with clear signs of prolonged neglect and physical abuse. She was forced to remain outside until she brought home food. She has been locked for hours in a closet as punishment. We will present medical documentation, testimony from a licensed physician, and statements from both the child and the social worker assigned to her case. Judge Whitaker nodded. Proceed with testimony. Dr. Renee Marshall was called first. Her voice was measured, clinical, but every word carried weight. She described Sophie's malnutrition, untreated bruises, and scars. These are not the result of clumsiness or accidents, she said firmly. They are consistent with repeated abuse and confinement. Karen Willis followed, laying out her investigation. She held up Sophie's crayon drawing of the padlocked closet. Children don't invent trauma like this, she said, her calm voice resonant in the hushed courtroom. They record it the only way they know how. Finally, Sophie herself was gently invited to speak. She stood nervously at the front, dwarfed by the witness stand, her small hands clutching her lunchbox. Her brown hair hung in messy strands over her pale cheeks, and her wide eyes darted between Daniel and the judge. Judge Whitaker leaned forward slightly, her tone gentler than before. Sophie, do you feel comfortable telling me what happens when you don't bring home food? Sophie's voice was thin but clear. Aunt Patricia says, if I don't, I have to stay in the closet. It's dark, and I get scared. Sometimes I fall. Sometimes I cry, but she doesn't open the door. She swallowed hard, then added in a trembling whisper, Officer Daniel. He didn't make me stand in the dark. He let me sleep with the light on. There was a heavy silence in the courtroom. Even Martin Crowley's smirk faltered. Patricia glared, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. Judge Whitaker's gavel tapped once. Thank you, Sophie. That was very brave. The judge turned her attention to Patricia. The testimony is compelling, but before we reach a decision, this court must consider any other evidence. It was then that Amelia produced a new folder, her voice ringing with purpose. Your Honor, yesterday evening, following a tip from Officer Harris's K-9 partner, Chicago police executed a search warrant on the basement of Ms. Doyle's property. She opened the file, displaying photographs. They discovered large quantities of contraband cigarettes and other smuggled goods. This not only confirms Officer Harris's suspicions, it also implicates Ms. Doyle in active criminal activity. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Patricia's face drained of color, while Martin Crowley stammered objections that Judge Whitaker silenced with a sharp look. This, Amelia continued, demonstrates not only neglect, but deliberate endangerment of a child in an environment tied to criminal networks. Sophie Miller deserves safety, stability, and care. She has found that with Officer Harris. We request immediate termination of Patricia Doyle's guardianship and the granting of temporary custody to Officer Harris, with permanency to be reviewed. Judge Whitaker sat in silence for a long moment, her pen tapping lightly against the bench. Finally, she spoke with calm authority. The court finds overwhelming evidence of abuse and neglect compounded by criminal activity. Effective immediately, Patricia Doyle's guardianship is revoked. Custody of Sophie Miller is awarded to Officer Daniel Harris as temporary guardian, pending full review for adoption. Ms. Doyle will be remanded to custody to face charges of child endangerment and aiding contraband trafficking. Patricia leapt to her feet, shouting protests, but two deputies quickly moved in to escort her out. Sophie shrank against Daniel as Patricia's voice echoed down the hallway, sharp and venomous, before fading away. Daniel crouched beside Sophie, his hand steady on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe now." Judge Whitaker's eyes softened as she looked down at Sophie. "You are a very brave little girl, and you're not alone anymore." As the courtroom emptied, Amelia gathered the files with a small, victorious smile. Karen leaned down to Sophie, handing her a stuffed bear someone from the Child Services office had brought. "This one's just for you," Karen said warmly. Sophie hugged it tightly, her face finally breaking into a tentative smile. Outside, as Daniel carried Sophie through the swirling snow toward his patrol car, Max trotted faithfully beside them, tail wagging just slightly. For the first time in months, Daniel felt a fragile thread of hope winding its way into his chest. Sophie was safe for now, and Patricia would no longer cast her shadow over the girl's life. The trial was behind them, yet Daniel Harris felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. Snow had begun to melt along the sidewalks of Chicago, leaving slush and patches of gray ice that reflected the pale sun. For the first time in months, the city carried the faint promise of spring. In the courthouse that morning, Judge Whitaker's words had become law. Daniel was no longer just Sophie's temporary guardian. He was now her father by choice, not by blood, but by vow, with every legal right and duty to protect her. When Daniel returned to his modest apartment on the north side of the city, he found himself looking at it with new eyes. The two-bedroom unit had always been functional, a space for a bachelor police officer and his loyal retired K-9. The walls were bare, the furniture practical. But now it had to become a home, not just for him, but for a 6-year-old girl who had lived too long in shadows. That weekend, Daniel rolled up his sleeves and began to transform the space. Sophie followed him through each room, her small hand holding onto Max's thick fur as if the dog were a pillar keeping her steady. Max, at 6 years old, with his muscular frame and alert amber eyes, moved through the apartment like a sentinel, sniffing corners, occasionally letting out soft grunts of approval or warning. Daniel brought home supplies, a tin of glow-in-the-dark star stickers, strings of golden fairy lights, and a lamp shaped like a crescent moon. In Sophie's new room, he painted the walls a soft blue, the color of early dawn. Sophie watched with wide eyes as he stuck stars across the ceiling, then carefully mounted the moon lamp on the dresser. "This way," he told her, his deep voice gentler than usual. "You'll never have to worry about the dark again." Sophie, still shy but slowly blossoming, picked up her box of crayons. She sat cross-legged on the floor and began sketching on a sheet of thick paper. Her small fingers moved quickly, almost urgently, as if she needed to capture her thoughts before they slipped away. When she was finished, she held it up, her brown hair falling into her face. It was a simple but powerful drawing. A man in a police uniform with broad shoulders, a big German shepherd standing proud beside him, and a smiling little girl holding their hands. Above them, Sophie had drawn a house with light spilling from the windows. At the bottom, in uneven letters, she wrote, "My family." Daniel's throat tightened. He crouched beside her, resting a large hand on her shoulder. "That's us," he said softly. Sophie nodded, her lips curving into the smallest of smiles. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "I have a home now." Later that evening, Daniel cooked spaghetti while Sophie set the table with clumsy eagerness. Max stationed himself at her side, his head tilted as if supervising. For dessert, Daniel surprised Sophie with hot chocolate, extra marshmallows melting on top. Sophie giggled, a sound so rare Daniel found himself laughing too, the sound echoing warmly through the apartment. Yet even in this new light, shadows lingered. Daniel knew trauma didn't vanish overnight. Sometimes Sophie woke in the middle of the night, clutching her lunchbox or standing in the hallway, afraid to return to her room. Each time, Daniel sat with her until she calmed, Max curling protectively at her feet. Slowly, Sophie began to trust that this light would not be taken away. A week later, Daniel proposed an outing. He took Sophie and Max back to the very street where their paths had first crossed. The alley where he had found her trembling against the cold brick wall was now washed in sunlight, though its cracked pavement and peeling paint still carried a sense of neglect. Daniel carried a bag filled with spray paint, brushes, and rolls of painter's tape. Sophie's eyes lit up when she saw them. "Are we going to paint?" she asked, her voice rising with excitement. Daniel smiled. "Not just paint. We're going to leave something behind, a reminder that no one should ever stand here alone again." Together they began. Daniel taped the edges of the wall while Sophie selected bold colors, deep blues for the night sky, bright yellows for stars, soft pinks for warmth. Max sat at their feet, watching with quiet dignity, his ears twitching every time a passerby slowed to look. For hours, the three of them worked, until the wall was transformed into a mural. It showed a wide-open door spilling light into a dark alley. Beyond the door stretched a sky bursting with stars, a path leading upward into hope. At the center, Sophie painted a girl in a pink dress, her face turned toward the light, her hand reaching for the stars. Daniel added a tall figure in uniform and the outline of a German shepherd by her side. At the bottom, in careful strokes, Sophie wrote the words Daniel had suggested, "For those who never walk away." When they finished, Sophie stepped back, her cheeks flushed with pride. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the sight of a child painting joy into a forgotten alley. An elderly woman with kind eyes and a cane whispered to Daniel, "That dog of yours, he's like a guardian angel." Daniel only nodded, his gaze on Sophie, who stood with her lunchbox now emptied of fear, her smile brighter than the painted stars. Max sat directly beneath the mural, his posture regal, ears upright, chest broad. In that moment, he looked less like a retired K9 and more like a living emblem of loyalty itself. Passers-by stopped to take photos, and soon someone posted the mural online. Within days, it became a symbol for the neighborhood, a reminder of resilience and hope. That night, back in their apartment, Sophie taped her newest drawing above her bed. This time, the picture showed the mural they had painted, but in her version, the stars glowed even brighter, and the words stretched across the sky. She curled beneath her blanket, her crescent moon lamp glowing softly, and whispered to Daniel as he tucked her in, "You stayed." "So I can stay too." Daniel kissed her forehead, his voice steady. "I'll always stay, Sophie. You're home now." Max lay down by the door, his body curled protectively, his amber eyes still glowing in the dim light. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something complete. It wasn't just about keeping a promise or fighting a case. It was about a family born in the snow, forged in courage, and bound by love. Outside, the city lights flickered against the winter sky, but in the apartment on the north side, the glow was softer, warmer. Sophie slept soundly, Max stood guard, and Daniel finally let himself believe that the dark chapter of their lives had closed. The house had light, now steady, unyielding, eternal. Sometimes, the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or lightning, but in the quiet choice of one person who refuses to walk away. For Sophie, it was not just the shelter of a warm home, but the light of love that reminded her that God never abandons his children. Through Daniel's courage, Max's loyalty, and a little girl's unyielding hope, we see how faith can turn even the darkest alleys into doorways of light. And this is true in our everyday lives. Each of us meets moments when someone nearby is standing in the cold, maybe not with bare feet in the snow, but with a lonely heart, a hidden wound, or a silent cry for help. In those moments, we are called to be God's hands and heart, to bring warmth where there is frost, hope where there is fear, and light where there is darkness. May the Lord bless you for taking this journey with us. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that miracles still happen. Comment below your thoughts, let us know where you are watching from, and subscribe for more stories of hope and redemption. May God's grace surround you and your family. May his light guide your steps, and may you always find the courage to never walk away.